Government by Judiciary is a 1977 book by constitutional scholar and law professor Raoul Berger which argues that the U.S. Supreme Court has interpreted the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution contrary to the original intent of the framers of this amendment, and that the U.S. Supreme Court has thus usurped the authority of the American people to govern themselves and decide their own destiny. Summary. In this book, Berger argues that the 14th Amendment should be interpreted based on the original intent of its draftsmen, and that the sole purpose of the 14th Amendment was to constitutionalize the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Berger rejects the use of statements by critics of the 14th Amendment to advance a broad reading of the 14th Amendment, arguing that these statements were made to make the 14th Amendment look scary and to defeat this amendment. Specifically, the purpose of that act was to tear down the black codes in the post-Civil War Southern U.S. and to give the freedmen basic rights such as freedom of contract, the right to sue and be sued, to travel and work wherever they please, and to buy, sell, and own property. Berger argues that, in the view of its draftsmen, the 1866 Civil Rights Act did not require U.S. states to allow African Americans to serve on juries, to vote, to intermarry with white people, or to go to the same schools that white people went to. Thus, Berger argues that numerous U.S. Supreme Court decisions based on the 14th Amendment have been wrongly decided, since they were decided contrary to the original intent of the 14th Amendment. These decisions include the 1880 case Strotter v. West Virginia, which stated that African Americans cannot be prohibited from serving on juries, the 1954 case Brown v. Board of Education, which struck down school segregation, and the 1960s one-person, one-vote cases such as Reynolds v. Sims. Berger also criticizes the idea of substantive due process as being contrary to the intent of the framers of the 14th Amendment and argues that, contrary to the statements of John Bingham and Jacob Howard, whose views Berger argues were unorthodox in the 39th Congress, the 14th Amendment was not intended to apply the U.S. Bill of Rights against the states. Finally, Berger defends the holding in the notorious 1896 case Plessy v. Ferguson and argues that the reason that Plessy has become a symbol of evil is because we impose upon the past a creature of our own imagining instead of looking to contemporaries of the events we are studying. Berger argues that Plessy merely reiterated what an array of courts had been holding for 50 years, starting with the 1849 Massachusetts Supreme Court case Roberts v. City of Boston, which upheld the constitutionality of segregated schools in Massachusetts. On a separate note, Berger argues that the U.S. Congress and not the courts were meant to have the exclusive authority to enforce the 14th Amendment. In Berger's view, the courts would only be allowed to enforce the 14th Amendment if the U.S. Congress was to delegate this authority to them. Aftermath. After this book was published, Berger spent 20 years responding to his critics, writing 40 article-length rebuttals and one of book length. References.